Have you ever stopped to consider the long, quiet shadow cast by a life lived in duty service? Imagine a woman born into staggering privilege, yet remembered, if at all, as the forgotten princess. While louder, brighter figures in the royal family commanded headlines with scandal and splendor, she endured wars, personal tragedy, and a century of relentless change, all with a dignity so understated it was almost invisible. Her name, Princess Alice, Duchess of Gloucester. How could someone who stood at the very heart of the House of Windsor become a ghost in its history books? And what does her silence reveal about the monarchy itself? To understand Alice, we must first understand the world that forged her. It was a world that, in many ways, no longer exists, a place of staggering contrasts, of immense power and unshakable certainty, all teetering on the precipice of cataclysmic change. She was born on Christmas Day, 1901, a poignant date that seems to hint at a life destined to be both celebrated and quietly overlooked amidst grander festivities. The year 1901 was a watershed moment. The great, formidable shadow of Queen Victoria had finally lifted from the world just 11 months earlier. For over 63 years, she had been the metronome of British life, an emblem of empire, duty, and a strict moral code that bore her name. Her death didn't just mark the end of a monarch's reign. It felt like the closing of an entire chapter of human history. Into this vacuum stepped her son, Edward VII. The Edwardian era had begun, and with it came a collective, albeit temporary, sigh of relief. The somber black crepe of Victorian mourning was replaced with the vibrant pastels of a new age. Society, at least for the very wealthy, became a playground of lavish weekend parties, opulent dinners, and a slightly more relaxed continental flair. But this glittering surface was deceptive. It was the long garden party before the storm, a final glorious summer before the world would be plunged into the darkness of the Great War. The British Empire, on which the sun famously never set, was, at its absolute zenith, a sprawling global dominion of over 400 million people. This power bred a unique kind of confidence, an almost divine sense of order and superiority, especially among the aristocratic class into which Alice was born. They were the hereditary rulers, the landowners, the politicians, and the military leaders who saw it as their birthright and solemn duty to govern. This was the world of Lady Alice Christabel Montagu Douglas Scott. She was not merely born into the aristocracy, she was born into its highest echelons. Her father was John Montagu Douglas Scott, the 7th Duke of Buccleuch and 9th Duke of Queensberry. To understand the significance of this title, one must look deep into the turbulent, blood-soaked history of Scotland. The Buccleuchs were not just landowners, they were kingmakers, warriors, and politicians who had shaped the destiny of the nation for centuries. Their lineage was a tapestry woven with threads of loyalty and rebellion, tracing back to the border reivers, the fierce, lawless clans who patrolled the volatile frontier between Scotland and England. Their lineage was famously intertwined with royalty. The family's vast fortune and ducal title originated with Anne Scott, a powerful Scottish heiress who married James Scott, Duke of Monmouth, the handsome but ill-fated illegitimate son of King Charles II. Although Monmouth was later executed for treason, Anne's titles and lands were preserved, ensuring that the blood of the Stuart kings flowed, however distantly, through the veins of her descendants. The family's wealth was almost unimaginable, built not on industry or commerce, but on land. They were among the largest private landowners in all of Europe, possessing vast estates that stretched across the Scottish borders, Dumfriesshire, and into England. Their holdings weren't just acres of farmland and grouse moor, they were a kingdom in miniature, comprising entire villages, towns, and a network of tenant farmers whose families had served the dukes for generations. This immense privilege came with an equally immense set of expectations. A life of leisure was not the goal, a life of duty was. For the sons, this meant a path through Eton or Harrow, followed by Oxford or Cambridge, and then a career in the military or Parliament. For the daughters, the path was just as rigidly defined, though far more constrained. Their purpose was to be the custodians of the family's social standing, to be graceful, accomplished, and above all, to make a good marriage, a strategic alliance that would preserve or enhance the family's bloodline and influence. Alice's childhood was divided between three magnificent and vastly different homes, each shaping a facet of her personality. There was Montague House in Whitehall, London. This wasn't just a townhouse. It was a veritable palace, a grand, imposing structure that stood shoulder to shoulder with the great offices of state. It was a home designed for political entertaining, a place of grand balls, soirees, and whispered conversations that could influence the direction of the empire. Here, young Alice would have learned the art of social navigation, the importance of etiquette, and the subtle dance of power that defined London society. Then there was the windswept majesty of Drumlanrig Castle in Dumfries in Galloway, Scotland, a colossal pink sandstone fortress with 120 rooms, 17 turrets, and 4 towers. Drumlanrig was the heart of the Buccleuch dynasty. It was a statement of power and permanence, filled with priceless art, including works by Rembrandt and Holbein, and surrounded by tens of thousands of acres of rugged Scottish landscape. Here, Alice developed her deep love for the countryside, for horses, and for the hardy, unpretentious spirit of the Scottish people who worked the land. It was at Drumlanrig that she learned to ride, to fish, and to appreciate the raw, untamed beauty of nature, a passion that would provide her with solace throughout her long life. The castle was a world away from the starched formality of London. It was a place of freedom, adventure, and connection to her ancient roots. Finally, there was Boughton House in Northamptonshire, often called the English Versailles. This was a more serene, elegant estate, a masterpiece of French-inspired architecture and landscape design. Its long avenues of lime trees and placid waterways spoke of a more ordered classical beauty. Boughton was a place for reflection, for art, and for the quiet pursuit of hobbies. It was here that Alice's love for gardening and painting likely took root, nurturing the more introspective, artistic side of her nature that often went unseen. Her education, like that of most aristocratic girls of her time, was conducted privately, at home, by a series of governesses. The curriculum was not designed to foster intellectual independence or prepare her for a career. Rather, it was designed to create an accomplished woman. She learned fluent French, the lingua franca of European high society. She was taught piano, singing, and watercolor painting, the essential skills for charming guests in a drawing room. She studied literature and history, but from a perspective that reinforced the greatness of Britain and the established social order. The goal was not to challenge her mind, but to polish it, to make her a fitting ornament for the society she was destined to adorn. This upbringing, while steeped in unimaginable privilege, was also a form of gilded cage. Individuality, especially for women, was not a prized commodity. Conformity was. Alice and her sisters were taught from birth to suppress their own desires in favor of duty, to maintain a composed public facade no matter the private turmoil, and to understand that their lives were not entirely their own. They were Montague Douglas Scott's first, and individuals Second, this doctrine of self-effacement and quiet duty was instilled so deeply that it would become the defining characteristic of Alice's entire life. She learned to observe, to listen, and to keep her own counsel, skills that would serve her well in the even more rigid world of the royal family. As Alice grew from a girl into a young woman, the world she had known began to fracture. The rumblings of war in Europe grew louder, and the seemingly indestructible social order began to show cracks. The suffrage movement was gaining a fierce momentum, challenging the very notion that a woman's place was solely in the home. The rise of trade unions and the Labor Party signaled a growing discontent among the working classes, who were no longer willing to accept the divine right of the aristocracy to rule. And then, in 1914, the Long Garden Party came to an abrupt, violent end. The First World War erupted, a cataclysm that would devour a generation of young men, including many from Alice's own class, and irrevocably alter the landscape of Britain and the world. The age of deference was dying, and the age of uncertainty was about to begin. For Lady Alice, a young woman on the cusp of adulthood, this meant that the carefully prescribed path laid out for her was about to become far more complicated than anyone could have ever imagined. The Great War was a brutal awakening. For a century, Europe had been spared a continent-wide conflict, and the British aristocracy in particular had come to see warfare as a distant colonial affair, a matter of a spot of bother in some far-flung corner of the empire. The reality of industrialized slaughter on the fields of Flanders and the Somme was a shock from which their class would never fully recover. It was a war that consumed its own elite, the sons of dukes, earls, and barons, who by tradition filled the junior officer ranks, led the charge from the trenches, and were cut down in their tens of thousands. The very system of primogeniture and inheritance that had sustained their families for 1,000 years was suddenly thrown into jeopardy as heir after heir was wiped out. For the young Lady Alice, then just a teenager, the war was not a distant headline. It was a chillingly personal reality. Her family, like every other great house in the land, was deeply enmeshed in the conflict. Her father, the Duke, threw the family's immense resources behind the war effort. Her elder brother, Walter Montague Douglas Scott, Earl of Dalkeith, served on the Western Front, surviving the horrors that claimed so many of his contemporaries. The anxiety that hung over the great houses during these years was suffocating. Every ring of the telephone, every delivery of a telegram brought with it a jolt of terror. Alice would have witnessed her mother and the other women of the household dedicating themselves to rolling bandages, knitting socks for soldiers, and converting parts of their grand homes into convalescent hospitals for the wounded. The glittering ballrooms of Montague House were silenced. The carefree country weekends at Drumlin replaced by a somber, all-consuming national purpose. This period was transformative for women of Alice's generation. With the men away fighting, women stepped into roles previously unimaginable. They worked in munitions factories, drove ambulances, and served as nurses near the front lines. While Alice was likely too young to participate in the most direct forms of war work, she was a keen observer of this societal shift. The war cracked open the gilded cage, proving that women were capable of far more than just needlepoint and polite conversation. The experience instilled in her a quiet resilience and a sense of pragmatism that would define her character. It also exposed her to a level of suffering and sacrifice that transcended class, leaving an indelible mark on her psyche. The world of absolute certainty she had been born into had vanished in a cloud of poison gas and cordite. When the armistice was finally signed in 1918, the world that emerged was profoundly changed. A deep collective grief hung over the nation. The old deference to the ruling class had been eroded by the shared trauma of the trenches. This new era, the Roaring Twenties, was a complex and contradictory time. On one hand, it was a period of frantic, almost hysterical gaiety, a desperate attempt to dance away the ghosts of the war. This was the age of jazz, of flappers, with their bobbed hair and rising hemlines, of cocktails and the Charleston. It was the era of the bright young things, a clique of bohemian aristocrats and socialites who scandalized polite society with their wild parties, treasure hunts through London, and flagrant disregard for the old rules. And where was Lady Alice in all of this? Conspicuously on the sidelines. Her reserved nature and deeply ingrained sense of propriety made her an awkward fit for the hedonistic whirlwind of the jazz age. While she was a debutante, presented at court as was expected, and attended the requisite balls and social functions, she never became a fixture of the gossip columns. She was not a fast girl. She was quiet, thoughtful, and, in the eyes of many of her contemporaries, perhaps a little dull. But what they mistook for dullness was, in reality, a burgeoning desire for a life of more substance than an endless series of parties could offer. She had seen the fragility of her world and felt a yearning for something more real, more tangible. This yearning manifested in a surprising and unconventional way. She became an adventurer. In an age when most women of her station were focused solely on finding a husband, Alice looked outwards to the vast, sun-drenched horizons of the British Empire. She began to travel, not on the carefully chaperoned grand tours of her mother's generation, but to more rugged, distant lands. She spent a significant amount of time in Kenya, which was then a magnet for a certain type of adventurous and often scandalous British aristocrat. This was the world of the infamous Happy Valley set, a community known for its decadent parties, wife-swapping, and heavy drinking. But Alice was not drawn to their hedonism. She was drawn to the land itself, the vast savanna, the stunning wildlife, and the freedom it represented. She went on safari, learned about the local cultures, and dedicated herself to her art, spending hours with her sketchpad and watercolors, capturing the light and landscapes with a talented and sensitive eye. Her paintings from this period reveal a woman deeply engaged with the world around her, not as a passive tourist, but as an active, appreciative observer. Her travels also took her to India and to what was then Ceylon. She explored ancient temples, navigated bustling markets, and crossed vast landscapes by train, often with a level of independence that was highly unusual for a single woman of her class. This was not just a holiday. It was a quiet rebellion. It was her search for a purpose beyond the ballroom, a way to expand her mind and spirit beyond the narrow confines of her upbringing. These journeys forged in her a steely self-reliance and a broad, cosmopolitan perspective. She was becoming a woman of the world, not just a lady of society. Meanwhile, back in Britain, the royal family, the institution she would one day marry into, was navigating the post-war world with extreme caution. The war had swept away the German, Austro-Hungarian, Russian, and Ottoman empires. Royal cousins, who had once ruled vast swathes of Europe, were now either dead, like the Romanovs, or living in quiet exile. King George V, a deeply conservative and pragmatic monarch, was acutely aware of the fragility of his own throne. He and his formidable wife, Queen Mary, consciously cultivated an image of steadfast, respectable, and somewhat bourgeois domesticity. Their court was the polar opposite of the flamboyant, bright young things. It was formal, rigid, and governed by an unbending protocol. The king was a stern patriarch who famously terrified his children, demanding of them the same unwavering commitment to duty that he demanded of himself. It was into this family that the king's third son, Prince Henry, was born. Born in 1900, Henry William Frederick Albert was in many ways the archetypal spare. He was never destined for the throne, a role reserved for his elder brothers, Edward, known as David to the family, and Albert, the future George VI. From an early age, Henry was overshadowed. David was the charismatic, impossibly handsome heir, the darling of the public. Bertie was quieter, burdened by a severe stammer, but possessed a deep inner strength. Henry was, well, Henry. He was known for his handsome but somewhat expressionless face, his military bearing, and a crippling shyness that could sometimes manifest as awkwardness or even a flash of temper. He was not an intellectual, nor was he a sparkling conversationalist. His passions were straightforward: the army, horses, and the predictable rhythms of country life. He was sent to Eton and then Sandhurst, the Royal Military Academy, embarking on a legitimate military career, primarily with the 10th Royal Hussars. It was a world in which he felt comfortable. The clear hierarchy, the camaraderie, and the focus on discipline suited his temperament far more than the glittering, gossipy world of the royal court. Yet, even in the army, he was never just another officer. He was always His Royal Highness, a fact that created an invisible barrier between him and his comrades. He was, by all accounts, a lonely man, trapped between the expectations of his birth and his own reserved, unpretentious nature. His father, the king, was perpetually frustrated by what he saw as Henry's lack of polish and his occasional explosive outbursts of anger, a trait that earned him the family nickname the Unknown Soldier, due to his blank expressions followed by sudden detonations. As the 1920s gave way to the 1930s, pressure began to mount on Henry to marry. His older brother David, the Prince of Wales, was nearing 40 and showed no signs of settling down, preferring a string of affairs with married women, most notably the American Wallis Simpson. This was causing the king immense anxiety. It fell to the younger sons to do their duty, to provide the nation with the stability of a royal marriage and, hopefully, heirs. Prince Albert had married Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon in 1923, a hugely popular match. Now, it was Henry's turn. The chosen bride was Lady Alice Montague Douglas Scott. It was, from the perspective of the king and queen, a perfect match. She was not a flighty debutante or a modern flapper. She was the daughter of a duke, from a family with impeccable lineage and a deep-seated tradition of service. She was sensible, dignified, and at 33, mature enough to understand the solemn responsibilities of royal life. Her quiet, reserved nature was seen as a perfect complement to Henry's own shyness. They had known each other for years, moving in the same rarefied social circles, but there had never been a spark. Their courtship was not a passionate whirlwind romance. It was a slow, deliberate, and carefully considered process. It was said that Henry's sister, Princess Mary, played a significant role in encouraging the match, seeing in Alice a steadying influence for her often troubled brother. Henry began to visit Boughton House, Alice's family home. They would go for long walks, ride horses together, and talk quietly, in the shared love of the countryside, of dogs and horses, and in their mutual dislike of fuss and ceremony, they found a common ground. He was drawn to her gentle nature and quiet intelligence. She, perhaps, saw beneath his awkward exterior a man of genuine kindness and duty. In the late summer of 1935, Prince Henry proposed. Alice accepted. It was the culmination of everything her life had been building towards. the ultimate fulfillment of the duty that had been ingrained in her since birth. Her adventurous, independent years of travel were over. She was about to step onto the main stage to become Her Royal Highness, the Duchess of Gloucester. The engagement was announced to the delight of the king and queen and the approval of the nation. The shy soldier prince and the quiet duke's daughter were to be married. But as preparations began for a grand wedding at Westminster Abbey, a shadow was already beginning to fall. The world was sliding inexorably towards another conflict, and the seemingly stable foundations of the British monarchy were about to be rocked by a scandal that would threaten its very existence. For Lady Alice, the quiet life was well and truly over. The path from lady to Her Royal Highness was meant to be paved with national celebration. The wedding of Prince Henry and Lady Alice was planned for November 6, 1935, and was intended to be a grand spectacle at Westminster Abbey, a joyous public event to lift the spirits of a nation grappling with economic depression and the rising threat of fascism in Europe. But from the very beginning, Alice's royal life was destined to be intertwined with private sorrow. Just 3 weeks before the wedding, on October 19th, her beloved father, the 7th Duke of Buccleuch, passed away after a battle with cancer. The grief was immense. Alice was exceptionally close to her father, a man who, for all his ducal grandeur, had a gentle and supportive nature. Suddenly, the elaborate plans for a state wedding felt jarringly inappropriate. In a mark of the quiet consideration that would define their relationship, it was the royal family, led by King George V and Queen Mary, who insisted on scaling back the ceremony. Out of respect for the bride's mourning, the venue was changed from the cavernous, public space of Westminster Abbey to the intimate, sacred confines of the private chapel within Buckingham Palace. The guest list was dramatically reduced, transforming a national spectacle into a deeply personal family affair. On her wedding day, Alice walked down the aisle on the arm of her brother, the new Duke of Buccleuch. She was a picture of serene, almost somber, elegance. Her wedding gown, designed by the celebrated couturier Norman Hartnell, was a masterpiece of simple elegance. Unlike the grand white gowns of many royal brides, hers was described by some observers as being a shade of blush pink, a subtle and respectful nod to her family's recent loss. It was a beautiful, dignified ceremony, but one underscored by a palpable sense of grief. This poignant beginning was a fitting, if unintentional, metaphor for Alice's future. Her greatest joys would forever be tempered by loss, and her public duties would always be performed against a backdrop of private resilience. Stepping into the royal family was like entering a different world, one with its own language, customs, and an unwritten constitution of suffocating protocol. Now the Duchess of Gloucester, Alice had to navigate the rigid formality of her in-laws' court. Queen Mary, in particular, was a stickler for etiquette. A formidable and intensely regal figure, she expected punctuality, propriety, and an almost religious devotion to duty from everyone around her. Yet a genuine affection grew between the two women. The Queen perhaps saw in Alice a kindred spirit, another woman who understood the importance of dignity, discretion, and putting the crown before all else. Alice, in turn, respected the Queen's immense knowledge and steadfastness, finding in her a source of guidance as she learned to navigate her new, complex role. Alice and Henry settled into York House at St. James's Palace. Their life was one of official engagements, opening hospitals, reviewing troops, and representing the king at home and abroad. They were the dependable, uncontroversial royal couple, the steady understudies to the dazzling, but increasingly erratic, Prince of Wales. And it was this older brother, David, who was about to plunge the monarchy into its greatest crisis of the 20th century. The storm broke less than 2 months after their wedding. In January 1936, King George V died. The nation mourned, and the Prince of Wales ascended the throne as King Edward VIII. The accession of the popular modern-seeming king was initially met with enthusiasm, but within the palace walls, a sense of dread was growing. The new king's obsession with Wallis Simpson, a twice-divorced American socialite, was becoming an all-consuming crisis. For Henry and Alice, as for the rest of the royal family, the situation was a nightmare. Their entire existence was predicated on the concepts of duty, sacrifice, and the sanctity of the Church of England, which forbade the remarriage of divorced persons. The king, as head of the church, was flagrantly violating its core tenets. For Alice, this period must have been bewildering. She, who had sacrificed her independence for a life of duty, was now watching the man who embodied that duty threaten to cast it all aside for personal desire. The family was torn apart. Tense, emotional meetings took place behind closed doors. Henry, ever the dutiful soldier, was reportedly furious with his brother's dereliction. He and his other brother, Bertie, the Duke of York, pleaded with the king to reconsider, to put his country and the crown before his personal feelings. But David would not be swayed. On December 11th, 1936, after a reign of just 326 days, King Edward VIII abdicated the throne. The crown passed to his stunned, unprepared, and stammering younger brother, who became King George VI. The abdication crisis had a profound and immediate impact on the Gloucesters. Overnight, their status changed dramatically. They were no longer a peripheral royal couple. They were now the brother and sister-in-law of the king, their children suddenly much closer to the line of succession. Their workload and public importance increased tenfold. They became essential pillars of support for the new, reluctant king and his wife, Queen Elizabeth, as they sought to restore the public's faith in a tarnished monarchy. Amidst this constitutional turmoil and the looming threat of another war with Germany, Alice found a source of deep and personal joy: motherhood. In December 1941, at the age of 40, she gave birth to their first son, Prince William. 3 years later, in August 1944, their second son, Prince Richard, was born. Motherhood suited Alice completely. She adored her boys and was a deeply involved, hands-on parent, determined to provide them with a childhood that was as normal and loving as their unique circumstances would allow. She spent hours with them, reading stories, playing games, and instilling in them her own love for the countryside. The births of her sons, coming in the darkest days of the Second World War, were a source of profound hope and happiness in a world consumed by violence. When war was declared in September 1939, the Gloucesters, like the rest of the royal family, remained in Britain and dedicated themselves to the war effort. Henry, a professional soldier, was eager to see active command, but was deemed too valuable a royal target to be sent to the front lines. Instead, he served as a chief liaison officer, undertaking vital and often dangerous missions to inspect troops and confer with commanders in various theaters of war. Alice, meanwhile, took on what would become one of the most significant roles of her life. She became the head of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, WAAF. This was no mere ceremonial patronage. She threw herself into the role with quiet, fierce dedication. Commissioned as an air commandant, she wore the uniform with pride and traveled tirelessly across the country, visiting RAF bases, command centers, and radar stations. These were not glamorous photo opportunities. She would arrive at airfields that had been bombed the night before, speaking with young women who had lost friends and colleagues, offering them comfort and encouragement. She inspected their living quarters, listened to their concerns, and became a deeply respected and beloved figure within the service. Her work was a vital contribution to maintaining morale among the hundreds of thousands of women serving in crucial, often perilous roles. This active uniformed service revealed a side of Alice the public rarely saw, a woman of immense fortitude, compassion, and practical determination. After the war, with Britain exhausted and nearly bankrupt, the Labour government of Clement Attlee began the process of dismantling the empire. It was in this context that King George VI asked his brother to take on one of the Commonwealth's most senior roles, Governor-General of Australia. It was a difficult decision for the Gloucesters. Their sons were still very young, and Alice was reluctant to move them halfway across the world. But duty, as always, came first. In early 1945, they embarked on the long sea voyage to Canberra. Their tenure of just over 2 years in Australia was a resounding success, largely due to Alice's quiet grace and genuine warmth. As the vicereine, she was the hostess of Government House, a demanding role that involved an endless cycle of receptions, state dinners, and official functions. But she did more than that. She traveled extensively with her husband, visiting remote parts of the vast country, from outback stations to small coastal towns. She showed a sincere interest in the Australian people, particularly in the work of women's organizations and charities. Her lack of pretension and her gentle demeanor charmed a nation that could be skeptical of British formality. She brought a touch of quiet elegance and steadfast dignity to the role, strengthening the bond between Australia and the Crown at a pivotal moment in their shared history. They returned to the United Kingdom in 1947, earlier than originally planned. The king's health was beginning to fail, and he needed his brother at his side to help with the burdens of state as a senior counselor of state. The family settled at Barnwell Manor, a historic estate in Northamptonshire that Alice had purchased. It was here that she was truly happy. She poured her energy into restoring the house and, above all, creating a magnificent garden. Barnwell became her sanctuary, a place where she could escape the rigid demands of royal protocol, be a mother to her boys, and indulge her passion for the natural world. Though their public duties continued, the post-war years at Barnwell represented a period of relative peace and domestic contentment for Alice, a quiet interlude before the devastating personal tragedies that lay ahead. The 1950s and 60s unfolded for Princess Alice in a rhythm of quiet contentment, a life neatly divided between her ongoing, if less strenuous, public duties and the private joys of Barnwell Manor. It was here, amidst the sprawling gardens she so meticulously cultivated, that she was able to fully embrace the role she cherished most, that of a mother. Her 2 sons were the center of her universe, and they could not have been more different. The younger, Prince Richard, was much like his parents, quiet, studious, and introspective. He possessed his mother's artistic sensibility and a thoughtful, serious nature. He was destined for a life of relative freedom, with plans to pursue a career as an architect, a profession that suited his precise and creative mind. He was the dependable, steady son, but it was the elder, Prince William, who captured the imagination. Born in 1941, he was the heir to the dukedom, and he was, by all accounts, a golden boy. He possessed a dazzling combination of his father's handsome looks and a charismatic charm, all his own. He was the antithesis of the stuffy royal stereotype. Where his father was shy and tongue-tied, William was confident and articulate. Where the court of his youth was rigid and formal, William was adventurous, daring, and possessed a restless spirit that yearned for a life beyond the confines of royal protocol. He was an adrenaline junkie before the term was even coined, drawn to anything fast and dangerous, skiing down treacherous slopes, flying his own plane, even trekking across the Sahara Desert. He was educated at Eton and Cambridge, but his real education came from his travels. Like his mother before him, he sought to escape the gilded cage. He joined the Commonwealth Office and embarked on a career as a diplomat, a role that offered him a measure of the independence he craved. He was posted to Lagos, Nigeria, and then to Tokyo, Japan. It was in Tokyo that the most significant and heartbreaking chapter of his personal life unfolded. There, he fell deeply in love with a woman named Juji Starkloff. Juji was, in the eyes of the royal establishment, a completely unsuitable match. She was not only a commoner, but a foreigner, a Hungarian divorcee with 2 children and several years his senior. But William was deeply in love, and for a time, he contemplated defying the entire system for her. Their romance was passionate and serious. He brought her to England to meet his parents, an audacious move. Alice, ever the pragmatist and devoted mother, was reportedly sympathetic to her son's happiness. She met with Juzi and treated her with kindness, a remarkable gesture given the circumstances. But the machinery of the monarchy was unyielding. The specter of the abdication crisis of 1936, which had so traumatized the family, loomed large. The Royal Marriages Act of 1772, a centuries-old law, stipulated that senior royals required the monarch's permission to marry. It was made clear to William that the Queen, his cousin, could never formally approve a union with a twice-divorced woman. He was faced with an impossible choice: renounce his love or renounce his birthright, his family, and his place in the line of succession. The pressure, particularly from courtiers at Buckingham Palace, was immense. Torn between love and duty, a conflict that had defined his family for generations, William eventually, and with profound heartbreak, ended the relationship. He returned to Britain a changed man, more subdued, his characteristic sparkle slightly dimmed by the sacrifice he had been forced to make. He threw himself into his 2 remaining passions, his royal duties, which he now accepted as his destiny, and flying. Aviation was his ultimate escape, the one place where he felt truly be. He became an accomplished and licensed pilot, owning several aircraft and competing in amateur air races. His mother Alice, though proud of his skill, lived with a constant quiet dread. In her memoirs, she later wrote about the perpetual anxiety she felt whenever he took to the skies, a chilling premonition of the tragedy to come. The day was August 28th, 1972. It was a warm, sunny August bank holiday. A crowd of 30,000 spectators had gathered at the Goodyear International Air Trophy competition at Halfpenny Green Airfield near Wolverhampton. Prince William, at the age of 30, was a competitor, flying his beloved Piper Cherokee Arrow. His co-pilot was a friend, Varel Lance. The mood was festive, a day of thrilling spectacle. Alice was at Barnwell Manor. The race began. Shortly after takeoff, William's plane banked steeply, its wing clipping a tree. The aircraft cartwheeled, crashed into an embankment, and immediately burst into a ball of flames. The crowd watched in horror. Prince William and his co-pilot were killed instantly. The news reached the family like a physical blow. The initial reports were confused, but soon the terrible finality of it all was confirmed. For a mother, there is no pain more unnatural, more devastating than the loss of a child. For Alice, the loss of William was the shattering of her world. He was not just her son, he was her charismatic, adventurous golden boy, the one who had inherited her own hidden yearning for a life beyond the palace walls. All her quiet fears, the perpetual anxiety she had lived with for years had materialized in the most brutal way imaginable. In her memoirs, written a decade later, the pain is still raw and palpable on the page. She described it as a nightmare and wrote, "His death was a searing, agonizing moment from which I have never fully recovered." In public, she was the epitome of royal stoicism. There were no dramatic outpourings of grief, no visible breakdowns. She attended the funeral, a dignified black-veiled figure, the very picture of regal composure. But behind the scenes, a part of her had died with her son. The light in her life had been extinguished. The tragedy was compounded by the declining health of her husband. Prince Henry had suffered the first of several severe strokes in 1965, which had left him largely incapacitated and wheelchair-bound. Alice had been his devoted nurse and companion for years, caring for him with unwavering dedication. The shock of William's death seemed to accelerate the Duke's decline. He was never fully able to comprehend the magnitude of the loss. His failing health mercifully shielded him from the worst of the grief that had consumed his wife. For Alice, the 2 years following William's death were a living purgatory. She was not only a bereaved mother, but also the full-time caregiver to her dying husband. The once happy halls of Barnwell Manor became a place of profound silence and sorrow. On June 10, 1974, less than 2 years after the plane crash, Prince Henry, Duke of Gloucester, died peacefully in his sleep. At the age of 72, Alice was now a widow. She had lost her adventurous firstborn son and her husband of nearly 40 years. The two central male figures in her life were gone. Her surviving son, Richard, had to abandon his promising architectural career to inherit his father's titles and, more importantly, his lifetime of royal duties, a heavy burden he had never expected to carry. Alice, now known as Princess Alice, Dowager Duchess of Gloucester, faced a future of unimaginable loneliness. She had fulfilled every duty asked of her, endured every trial with quiet grace, and had been rewarded with the cruelest of fates. The long, quiet winter of her life had begun. The silence that descended upon Barnwell Manor in the mid-1970s must have been deafening. The echoes of a vibrant son's laughter and the steady presence of a husband were gone, replaced by the quiet routine of a life irrevocably altered. For many, such a double bereavement would be a crushing final act, a reason to retreat entirely from the world. But Alice was forged from the steel of the Buccleuchs and tempered by a lifetime of royal duty. Retreat was not in her nature. And so, in the long twilight of her life, she did the only thing she knew how to do. She carried on. Her public life continued, albeit at a gentler pace. She remained the patron or head of numerous organizations, attending functions and lending her support with the same quiet dignity that had always been her hallmark. She continued to represent her niece, the Queen, at events both at home and abroad. To the public, she was a familiar, if understated, presence, a constant figure who had been part of the royal tapestry for as long as most people could remember. This unwavering commitment to duty, even in the depths of her personal grief, was not for show. It was the very core of her being. It was the purpose that kept her going. In 1983, she did something quite remarkable for a royal of her generation and temperament. She published her memoirs, titled The Memoirs of Princess Alice, Duchess of Gloucester. The book was not a scandalous tell-all, but a gentle, discreet, and deeply personal reflection on her extraordinary life. It was her chance to tell her story in her own words, to paint her own watercolors of the past. In its pages, she spoke of her adventurous youth, the challenges of royal life, and with poignant restraint, the searing, agonizing pain of losing her son. The publication was a quiet assertion of self From a woman who had spent a lifetime in the shadow of others, it remains one of the most valuable and intimate accounts of 20th century royal life from someone who was truly on the inside. Her surviving son Richard, the new Duke of Gloucester, and his wife Birgitte became the pillars of her existence. They, along with their children, filled the void at the heart of her life with new love and laughter. For 2 decades she remained at her beloved Barnwell, finding solace in her gardens, which became a living memorial to the happy years she had spent there. But the passage of time is relentless. In 1994, at the age of 93, facing the challenges of advancing age, she made the pragmatic and difficult decision to leave her sanctuary. She gave up Barnwell Manor and moved into an apartment at Kensington Palace to be close to Richard and his family. It was the final chapter in a long life of quiet sacrifices made for the sake of family and practicality. As we look back on her century-long life, we must confront that persistent label, the forgotten princess. Why does it stick to a woman who is so central for so long? The answer is complex. On one hand, it was a reflection of her own character. Alice was inherently shy, a private person who had the unique destiny of living a very public life. She never sought the spotlight. Indeed, she seemed to instinctively shy away from it. Her quiet dedication and lack of personal scandal made her a poor subject for the sensationalist headlines that began to define royal reporting in the latter half of the century. In a world increasingly drawn to celebrity, her brand of quiet duty seemed almost archaic. But her forgotten status is also a commentary on the rigid structure of the monarchy itself. As the wife of a third son, she was, by definition, a supporting act. The focus was, and always is, on the sovereign and the direct line of succession. Her contributions, from her vital work with the WAF to her successful term in Australia, were significant, but they were footnotes in the grand narrative of the crown. This brings up a subtle but important debate. Was her understated role a personal choice, or was it the only one available to a woman of her position and era? The truth is likely a seamless blend of the two. Her personality perfectly suited the limited supportive role the institution required of her. She did not chafe against the bars of her gilded cage. She simply made a quiet, dignified life within them. The tragic story of her son, Prince William, and his doomed love for Julie Starkloff offers a poignant what if. In a later interview, Julie herself speculated that had William been allowed to marry her, he would have left royal life, settled in America, and perhaps never have taken up the dangerous hobby of air racing. While this is pure speculation, it raises a gentle but persistent question about the human cost of the monarchy's inflexibility. The institution's terror of repeating the abdication crisis cost William his happiness, and perhaps indirectly, his life. It is a quiet controversy, a point of reflection on the clash between ancient tradition and individual human desire that played out with such devastating consequences for Alice's family. As the 20th century drew to a close, Princess Alice's significance grew exponentially, not for what she did, but for what she was. She became a living bridge to a world that had vanished into history books. She had known the court of King George V, a world of imperial grandeur and rigid protocol. She had lived through the abdication, a family trauma that reshaped the monarchy. She had served in a world war that had claimed the lives of millions. As her contemporaries passed away one by one, she became the last witness. In December 2001, the royal family gathered to celebrate her 100th birthday. It was a remarkable milestone, a moment of national celebration for a woman who had served her country with quiet distinction for nearly 70 years. In an era when the younger generation of royals was plagued by divorce and scandal, Alice stood as a powerful symbol of the values the monarchy sought to represent: duty, endurance, and unimpeachable dignity. Her life was a testament to a different age, a different code of conduct. Her stoicism in the face of unimaginable personal tragedy earned her a deep and quiet respect from the British public. She was no longer just a minor royal. She was a matriarch, a survivor, the beloved great aunt of the nation. Her most profound legacy is an emotional one. It is a story of resilience. Her life demonstrates the capacity of the human spirit to withstand the cruelest of blows, the loss of a child, the loss of a partner, and to continue not with bitterness, but with grace. She teaches us that strength is not always loud and demonstrative. It can be quiet, private, and found in the simple act of putting one foot in front of the other, day after day, for a lifetime. In the early hours of October 29, 2004, Princess Alice, Duchess of Gloucester, died peacefully in her sleep at Kensington Palace. She was 102 years old, and at the time of her death, the longest living member of the British royal family. Her life was a study in quiet contradiction. She was the reluctant duchess who yearned for adventure but embraced a life of duty. She was the forgotten princess who became one of the monarchy's most enduring and respected figures. She lived through a century of unprecedented, violent change, yet she herself remained a figure of serene consistency. But beyond the titles, the palaces, and the sweep of history, her story is, at its heart, a profoundly human one. It is the story of a mother's love and a mother's grief. It is a testament to the fact that even a life swathed in privilege is not immune to the sharpest edges of human sorrow. Princess Alice's journey reminds us to look beyond the pomp and ceremony to find the real stories, the quiet, untold chapters of resilience, sacrifice, and the enduring power of a graceful spirit. She may have lived in the shadows of the throne, but the light cast by her quiet dignity, her unwavering sense of duty, and her immense personal courage shines on, a gentle, lasting echo of a truly remarkable life.